Alright everyone, now it's time to talk a little bit about critical race theory being swapped out for critical thinking theory. I like that particular linguistic line. I think that that's pretty mimetic and impressive. That's partially why I'm actually covering this. Link in the description, archived of course, to an article by John Feary. I have not seen this particular juxtaposition used before, but it was impressive enough to spawn a video, so congrats to you from, a person who knows a bit about memetics. Yes, this is what should be done. Critical race theory is basically pseudo-Marxism. You could just label it Marxism light minus class war, but that's basically what CRT is. You've swapped out class. The ultimate struggle between people comes down to the upper class versus everyone else, the rich and empowered versus the poor and disempowered in various forms. And then the bourgeois stuck in the middle. Usually everyone attacks and hates them. And regardless of who wins, they get fucked, the middle classers and the merchants, because everyone dislikes them so much. That's critical race theory. You've just swapped that out for race war, basically. It's funny how it would be promulgated if you were to use the same basic elements of Marx and Engels, etc., and like the suggestions of how to bring about Marxism and apply them to an expanded critical race theory. It would literally be arguing for a form of racial war. And indeed, it already argues for that in everything other than the use of violence. It literally, explicitly condones the idea of weaponizing the legal system and the justice system in order to even the odds, get those reparations in, equalize people, make more equity, which means taking from people who have a bit more, even though it's not going to take from the super rich. Just from like the regular average white person has to give money to the regular average black person or whatever. Statistically speaking, it's all over the place. I've already analyzed this. It ignores crime statistics. It ignores wealth statistics, especially within the context of the United States. But the idea of swapping it out for critical thinking theory, I think this is a good linguistic shot because it argues from the same basic foundational premise and simply changes the idea slightly. So critical race theory argues the educational system needs to be overhauled in order to create racial justice. They class it as a reform of the educational system, which they see as all too colorblind. Critical thinking theory would be the concept, no, critical race theory be damned. The real problem is that we teach people how to memorize things. We dumb down testing standards so they don't even necessarily have to do that particularly well. And that's the main focus of education. We don't teach the basic premise of critical thinking to teach children how to think in order to apply that to a wide range of situations. We don't teach them that. This was something that in ancient philosophical times was considered relatively important. The ability of your student to synthesize material separate from the learned elder, the sage, the master, the philosopher, was considered in general to be reasonably important. If your students were not capable of doing this and simply regurgitated what you said, eventually your philosophical grift ran out. And let's face it, most of the philosophers that we consider great today, they were grifters. Hey, donate to my temple, donate to my school. Come and send your kid here. Slay the fatted calf or else I won't teach them. Very interesting. People think that they were just a free-for-all. They went from door to door begging for their bread and gave philosophy in return or something. It's not quite how most of them lived, unless you're talking about Diogenes. He didn't give a fuck. He'd eat animal poop if he wanted to. This, though, linguistically is commendable, so good on John Feary. And actually, if you look him up, he worked for like Tom DeLay and some other Republicans back in the day. So he was like a staffer that was in with several of the big heavy-hitting Republicans in the 2000s period, I think it was, which is interesting. Going past that, though, the premise is good. Most of the time, people identify problems. And once you have proposed a solution, that solution is favored by groups which condone the means involved, the methods involved, until it is displaced by something else. Here's the problem with how some people are attacking critical race theory. They're saying get rid of critical race theory while leaving the underlying premise the educational system is broken and not bringing in a replacer for critical race theory. In some cases you see, fuck it, homeschool. Some people are like, well, we'll bring Jesus back into the school. That'll solve the problem. The problem is that the former doesn't work for the average person. They don't have the capability to homeschool and maybe the money to tutor or something like that. Like if your kid is in a public school, at the very least, work a side job, a side hustle or something and get him a tutor for a couple of extra things. Get them a second language and teach them real history, because trust me, they're not going to learn it in the regular school. Either that, or the religious premise, which is like, well, there's private schools, number one, charter schools that already do the religious thing, and number two, again, that doesn't apply to a bulk of the population that doesn't support the idea of having a religious edifice teaching your kids. They want it to be a secular, comparative religion's okay style thing. So you have to replace critical race theory. And the underlying premise out of which all of these things grow is correct. The critical race theorists are not wrong when they identify that the educational system in the United States is broken. We can look at our attainment statistics or our test scores, and we can clearly see that. They just don't focus on the academic angle or the premise of education in general. They focus on how to use education to push a political narrative, to push a social narrative. It's a form of socialism, basically. They're trying to use state-funded schools to indoctrinate people. Critical thinking, of course, is the opposite of indoctrination. You're literally telling someone, hey, you should think for yourself. All the rest of the day in school, you're in your critical thinking class. All these other classes, your goal is to memorize for a test. I want you to think critically about things. Then you pose questions, you have discussion, you have dialogue and so forth, and team building. And the basic idea is that if it clicks in their head, and it doesn't always do this, then they will start applying that critical thinking to broader scenarios. So when they're out there in the real world and they're posed with a problem, they're posed with a potential solution, maybe they identify it as a pig in the poke non-solution. Maybe they understand the basic premise of logic. It'd be wonderful if, by the way, basic logic were taught in high schools. Should be part of a civics battery. They should have a couple of years of basic civics, beyond senior law and history and stuff. Wouldn't be that hard. Teach basic logic, basic debate, things of that nature. They should be considered, it's more important than physical education. It's more important at this point than math, since they're teaching kids 2 + 2 = 5 on a regular basis. But yes, replacing it with something that is similarly named and has more positive, broad connotations, this would be, if this were to go viral, the basic premise, it would take off. And it would, defeat CRT even faster. Look, pointing out that it's self-contradictory, that it's based partially on a readaptation of communism, that it completely woefully misdescribes basic statistic models with regards to income and crime and so forth. All those are well and good. I literally wrote a booklet on the subject debunking critical race theory's main tenets. But then you also have to propose, because the underlying problem that CRT is meant to address, it's a pig and a poke, but it does attempt to do this. It attempts to use that premise, rather, to promulgate itself, like a parasitic mushroom on a rotting log. Instead, you need something else to displace critical race theory to address that same central problem that is more able to address it than critical race theory can. Now that's that's low-hanging fruit. That's not a hard act to follow. But you've got to actually propose it and categorize it and make it something worthwhile. That's about all. Peace out.